Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 286, The Lord Admiral Falls. Today we are back in England. King Edward is still a child. Somerset is still Lord Protector. England still needs allies. The Reformation remains unfinished, and Somerset's brother, Thomas Seymour, the aforementioned Lord Admiral, remains as big of a problem as he was when we last left off. Feel caught up? Great. Let's keep moving. With enough troubles at home to fill a swimming pool, Somerset decided to invade Scotland. Whether this was simply an effort to distract those at court from the chaos everyone now found themselves knee-deep in, I'm not sure. Regardless, Somerset knew full well how badly Henry VIII's campaign into Scotland had gone back in 1544. He, on the other hand, was determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. He would not underestimate his foe. After a busy summer of preparation, at the end of August 1547, Somerset marched north at the head of some 16,000 troops, accompanied by over 80 ships. Somerset would not repeat Henry's error. He was coming with overwhelming force. England made an offer of peace conditional upon the acceptance of a treaty of marriage between Edward and Mary, Queen of Scots. Once this had been rejected, the battle lines were drawn up near Pinkie, near Edinburgh. The Scots clearly had the upper hand, both in terms of numbers of men and the impregnable location that they had chosen. But rather than defend this awesome position, they chose to sally forth, with fatal results. With the English broadside cannons pounding the advancing Scottish army, it fell into disarray. The ranks broken, the Scots fled in panic. Where their army had stood, there was now, quote, a wood of staves strewed on the ground as rushes in a chamber, end quote. The Scots split into three directions, one toward the beach at Leith, the other towards the walls of Edinburgh, hoping to escape through the breaches into the city, and most fled towards Dalkeith, into a marsh where pursuit proved impossible. The English sensed a rout. Following on their heels, the chase continued for 5 miles westward, from Inverness through Edinburgh Park and on to Leith. Lasting for 5 hours, between 1 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon, it turned into an orgy of killing. Most Scots were hacked down by blows to the head or neck. As they ran, weapons were thrown aside in the hopes of gaining speed over the enemy, though this too played into the English hand. The weapons of the dead, lying scattered on the plain, were now taken up by those still living, whose own swords had been shattered through overuse. A few Scots put up a defiant stand, lashing at the legs of the English horse, splitting open their bellies. Some lay in furrows and feigned death only to escape litter, while others hid in the river, quote, with scant his nose above the water for breath, end quote. In desperation, men threw their shoes and doublets aside and ran in their shirts, some running until they were breathless and died from sheer exhaustion. When this quote-unquote battle had ended, quote, the dead bodies lay as thick as a man may note cattle grazing in a fully replenished pasture, end quote. The nearby rivers ran red with blood, and some 13,000 Scots had lost their lives. Edward was overjoyed at the news of the victory. He was even happier when he found out that, amongst the Scottish dead, were scores of Catholic priests and monks. This will not be the last time, by the way, that I say that someone was over the moon with news that their religious rivals had been cut down. Somerset returned to London shortly thereafter. He was suspicious of what his brother was up to and did not trust him with his back turned. Unfortunately, because he did that, Somerset could not follow up on his victory. This gave the Scots a chance to recover. It was a critical mistake, caused purely by his own sense of insecurity. Seymour had chosen to remain in London, rather than traveling with the army. While Somerset was gone, he tried his best to poison the boy king against the Lord Protector, exactly what Somerset had feared. He told King Edward that Somerset's invasion was a waste of money. In addition, Seymour started bribing the king with regular cash payments. That might sound absurd, but Somerset had a habit of tightly controlling Edward's budget. Edward quickly became accustomed to these cash payments. After Somerset's return, however, Seymour's unfettered access to the king came to an abrupt end. Upon his return, Somerset discovered that his brother was not the only problem he faced. When the commissioners enforcing the new religious injunctions had begun their work in September, their enthusiasm got the better of them. On September 5th, images were pulled down at St. Paul's. Across the country, a program of mass iconoclasm had begun, with images in churches smashed and medieval wall paintings whitewashed over and replaced with the text of the Ten Commandments. At Shrewsbury, they made a bonfire of images in the marketplace, while in Muchwennock, Shropshire, they burnt the local saint's bones. In Durham, the royal commissioner went as far as to smash up images with his own hands, literally jumping up and down on them. Resistance was hopeless. When the conservative bishops, Stephen Gardiner and Edmund Bonner, protested, they soon found themselves locked in jail. Others made the most of their situation. Many Catholics fled abroad with their treasured relics, but others quickly had them melted down in anticipation of their destruction and confiscation. In Greyfriars Church near St. Paul's, men, quote, pulled up all the tombs, great stones, all the altars, with the stalls and walls of the choir and altars, to be sold. When the council were informed in October that Christ Church, Canterbury, intended to have their pyx of gold and silver crucifix coined in order to make repairs to the church, they ordered that the relics be kept entirely safe and whole, end quote. In an attempt to avoid whole-scale destruction and anarchy, the council, the Privy Council that is, suggested that any images not abused might be retained, and that windows containing images of the Pope could be defaced or covered over rather than smashed. But it was all too little, too late. Throughout the autumn, the assault on images continued, and on the night of the 16th of November, the rod loft in St. Paul's, along with the images of Mary and St. John, were destroyed, ultimately resulting in the death of 2 workmen. The government tried to clamp down, but all these efforts were undercut by the reality that elements of the Catholic Church, including the Mass, were no longer celebrated anywhere, including in Somerset's own household. Somerset remained interested in real reform, though. He thought that the treason laws passed in the waning days of Henry VIII, and which made it a law to speak against the king at all, were just too far over the top. Somerset had this law repealed and replaced it with the traditional definition of treason, which is plotting the death of the king or his heirs, waging war against the king, or serving his enemies. Ironically, by the way, Henry VIII had also introduced such lenient legislation upon his own ascension, only to scale it back before his death. Then, as now, it had been a political move intended to make the new monarch popular. Somerset also looked to Parliament to enhance his already considerable powers. Alarmed by Seymour's behavior and closeness to Edward, he realized the need to secure his position more fully. And so he drafted a bill that would be ratified in Parliament, which would legally confirm and extend his authority, giving him special precedence in the House of Lords, a quasi-regal status that would allow him to sit alone, quote, upon the middle of the bench or stool, standing next to on the right hand of our siege royal, end quote. Whereas earlier documents stated that Somerset would have the protectorship of Edward until he reached the age of 18, now his powers would remain in force, quote, until such time as we declare to our said uncle our pleasure, by writing with our hand and sealed with the Great Seal of England, end quote. It seemed that Somerset's authority, now entirely in the hands of the king, would become unfettered. Somerset's brother Seymour now found himself in a considerably diminished position. Yet, he remained determined to supplant his brother. This was delusional, but Seymour remained committed to his harebrained scheme. Trying to salvage his position, Seymour started befriending different members of the nobility in an effort to win over their support. His most powerful ally was Henry Grey, the Marquess of Dorset, though it's doubtful he would have had anything to do with Seymour had he known the full extent of his plans. Seymour, at this point, was plotting nothing less than open rebellion. To ferment this, Seymour needed men. In 16th century England, that meant he needed land. Specifically, he needed the support of the great landed magnates who could provide him with, in essence, private armies. He soon began to fashion these connections through contacts. His strategy here was twofold. He wanted to counteract parts of England where his brother's support was solid. Plus, he wanted to pinpoint those members of the Privy Council, or in some cases, members of the same, who were disaffected with Somerset's regime. He approached Lord Wriothesley on his way to dinner in late 1547, telling him, quote, "My lord, you were well handled touching your office. Would you not have it again?" End quote. Soon, Seymour was confident he had the full support of at least 5 councillors. To bolster his power, Seymour quickly began buying and levying land on a huge scale. Land in early modern Europe was power. And of course, as the Lord Admiral, Seymour already had the power of the Navy behind him. But even if Seymour raised all these private armies, how could he possibly afford them? If he needed 10,000 men a month and each was paid only 6 pence per day, that still yielded an astronomical total cost of around £2.4 million. Seymour didn't have anything like that kind of money. His plan was that he would simply make it. If he could flip the under-treasurer of the Mint of Bristol to his side, a man he already knew, then he could obtain a license to print money. But this was not the extent of the trouble he was making for his brother. As if marrying Catherine Parr wasn't bad enough, Seymour now tried to seduce the 15-year-old Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I. She wasn't having it, by the way, at least not at first. According to one report, if Elizabeth was still in bed in the mid-morning hours, Seymour would burst into the room, pull open the bed curtains, and jump in, quote, as though he would come at her, end quote. Elizabeth, terrified, retreated to the corner of the bed. Catherine took this behavior to be nothing more than innocent playfulness. Things changed, however, when Elizabeth reportedly started taking an interest in him. Suddenly, the princess found herself packed off to live with a relative, though Seymour, according to the reports, was chastised as well. Meanwhile, the religious situation in England continued to deteriorate. Attacks on the Mass, despite a proclamation banning them, continued unabated. Henry's prior order banning the reading of the Bible had been repealed, and people were, learning the text for themselves. Something had to give. So in February of 1548, the government relented and ordered all images, idolatrous or not, removed from every church and every chapel in England. Across the kingdom, the vestiges of ancient religion were literally torn down. Edward understood all this. He took a keen interest in religious issues, not that he had a response to any of these problems. And yet there were more problems still. Now, this one I haven't talked about yet, but I need to introduce it because it's going to be a major headache for England in the coming century. I'm talking about enclosure. Enclosure, put simply, was the process by which local landlords turned what had been communal lands, so lands generally used by the local villagers, into grazing lands for his own sheep, so privatizing what had been community property. This process enraged the rural English community, and it made it so much harder for these families to survive. On May 17, 1548, for the first time, a landowner who had enclosed a plot of land, in this case it was a rabbit warren, found his actions met with violence. Enclosure, by the way, wasn't a new problem even then. Indeed, going back to Sir Thomas More, he complained that the landlords were allowing, quote, sheep to eat up men, end quote. That's kind of the famous quotation for the start of this process. Yet, the increased demand for wool only led to an increased demand for sheep. Hence, despite the complaints, the enclosures kept coming. Sheep also took up public grazing lands that had been used for communal cattle, removing milk and cheese from the diet of the poor, and both had been dietary staples. The English government had not been innocent in this. Henry VIII had badly debased the coinage for his wars in France and Scotland. Inflation in less than a decade had risen 77%. Hence, landlords were, to an extent, trying to rebalance the scales through enclosure. But in addition, the English population had increased dramatically, making an already bad land shortage even worse. In the counties around London, between 1520 and 1603, the population had ballooned from 60,000 to 200,000. Spoiler alert, by the way. Really, the only pressure release valve which is going to work for England is going to be sending people to the colonies. Still, for the moment, Somerset ordered local commissioners to investigate the problem and determine potential solutions. Somerset knew what he was doing. He understood the need for popularity. He, after all, was not king. And unsurprisingly, though, his efforts met with extreme resistance from the landowners. But soon enough, affairs in Scotland pushed all these concerns to the back burner. Somerset's quote-unquote rough wooing of Scotland was proving expensive. Then, as we already know, Mary, Queen of Scots, successfully fled her kingdom to France. The whole ostensible purpose of this had been to force a marriage between her and Edward. Now it was not to be, and many began asking, what was the point of spending all this money? Throughout the summer of 1548, Seymour stayed with Catherine, who was pregnant with this child. This irked Somerset because, in removing himself from London, Seymour was effectively shirking his duties as Lord Admiral. But Seymour thought he was doing his duty to his wife, whose pregnancy was proving difficult. On August the 30th, Catherine delivered a healthy baby girl that the couple named Mary. But Catherine fell ill almost immediately after giving birth to the child, and 2 days later, she died. Her death changed everything. Seymour lost his major source of legitimacy for any proposed coup. Seymour also lost his mind as a result. He would later admit that, during the period following the death of his wife, he had, quote, small regard either to myself or my doings, end quote. Without the backing of the Queen's court, Seymour lost his status. But Catherine's death opened up other opportunities, mostly because Seymour was now able to marry again. He set his sights immediately on Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Grey. The Grey family was one of the most powerful in England. Yet while rumors continued to circulate about Jane's potential match to Seymour, it now appeared that Seymour had other things in mind. His intention was to marry Jane not to himself, but to King Edward. He felt if he brokered a successful union, he might parlay the goodwill into a stronger position for himself at court. I mean, It worked a lot in the past with Edward's father. Why not try it again? He might even hope to supplant his brother. While Seymour pressed King Edward to marry Jane, he turned his eye to Edward's half-sister, Elizabeth. This union, however, for the moment he knew was not possible. So long as Somerset remained in control of Edward, he would never consent to a marriage between Elizabeth and his younger brother. Seymour was rapidly alienating himself and was beginning to appear unstable. Soon his activities raised the suspicions of other members of the nobility. Wriothesley wrote, quote, "For God's sake, take heed what you need to do. You may say what you will, that you mean well and mind all for the king, but indeed you shall show yourself his greatest enemy. You may begin a faction and trouble, but you cannot end it when you would." End quote. Seymour was reprimanded by several other influential members of court for his behavior, everyone telling him he ought to be content with the position of Lord Admiral and get on with it. Seymour refused to listen. In desperation, Seymour pinned all of his hopes on Edward. He hoped to make Edward realize his point of view. Visiting him at Hampton Court, he walked with Edward in the garden. Seymour wrote, quote, "Since I saw you last, you are grown to be a good gentleman. I trust that within 3 or 4 years you shall be the ruler of his own things." End quote. According to Seymour's diary, "Nay," came the reply from the king. Seymour did not give up that easily. Ostensibly counting out each year of Edward's age, he feigned surprise. He wrote in his diary, quote, "Within these 3 or 4 years, your grace shall be 16 years old. I trust by that time your grace will help your men yourself, with such things as fall in your grace's gift." Yet Edward refused the answer, and the conversation soon turned to other matters. It was clear that Seymour would have to find another way to have his nephew see his point of view. Seymour was clearly up to something, though. He was actively stockpiling food and other resources at one of his castles, while his closest ally, William Sherrington, coined 7,500 illicit pounds for his use. These certainly looked like the sort of preparations one might make for a civil war. Seymour traveled from location to location in the dead of night to avoid being seen. He worked meticulously to move all his pieces into place for what he assumed would be a successful coup. All this activity, of course, left his brother feeling extremely suspicious. He informed those at court that he needed to speak to Seymour immediately. Hearing of this, Seymour decided the time had come to act. On the 16th of January, 1549, he broke into the privy garden accompanied by 2 servants. Pistol in hand, he made his way uninterrupted until he reached Edward's bedchamber. But fumbling with the key to the door, he came against an unforeseen obstacle. Opening the outer door, he was attacked by Edward's dog. Surprise overcame him, and in desperation, he actually shot the dog. Edward's bodyguard awoke, their cries of "Help! Murder!" rising the alarm as they rushed to Edward's defense. There they found Seymour, who proclaimed his innocence, for he was only making sure that the king was securely guarded. Edward, of course, was safe in his bed, no doubt terrified. It seems if Seymour was checking to see if Edward was securely guarded, he had his answer. On the floor lay, quote, "the lifeless corpse of the dog," end quote. It had been, as one of Edward's bodyguard remarked, quote, "the most faithful guardian of the king's majesty," end quote. A man later wrote, "Unless the king's majesty had accidentally left his dog outside and bolted the inner door of his chamber, which is seldom done, it certainly would have been all over for him," end quote. But was this really an accident? Was Seymour really checking on Edward's security? If Edward knew something, if he suspected something, he didn't let on. At least for the moment, he didn't show his cards. But what on earth would Seymour have been planning to do with Edward anyway, had he gotten to him? He would have gained absolutely nothing from killing the boy. Regardless of his intentions, though, Seymour found himself arrested the very next day. When he was finally examined on the 23rd of February, 1549, he refused to make any answers unless his accusers were brought before him. The right to confront witnesses, by the way, would later be something the American colonists would enshrine in their constitution. At some stage, Edward himself gave evidence against Seymour. His testimony sealed Seymour's fate. For Somerset, the king's words must have struck straight through him. Edward was on record as having wished him dead. Quote, "It were better for him to die before," end quote. No longer could Somerset claim that he was Edward's trusted guardian and beloved uncle. As the evidence unfolded, Seymour's affair with the Princess Elizabeth became open knowledge. She was interviewed herself, as were Ashley, Elizabeth's maid and go-between, and Thomas Parry. All three remained tight-lipped, their confessions so similar that their interrogator grew suspicious. "They all sing one song," he wrote to Somerset, continuing, "and so I think they would not do unless they had set the note before, for surely they would confess, or else they could not go so well agree. I do believe that there hath been some secret promise, never to confess to death, and if it be so, it will never be gotten of her." The Princess Elizabeth sought to limit the damage. She wrote to Somerset in late January 1549, protesting her innocence, writing, quote, "There goeth rumors abroad, which greatly both against my honor and honesty, that I am in the Tower, and with child by my Lord Admiral. My lord, these are shameful slanders, for which I shall most heartily desire your lordship, that I may come to court after your first determination, that I may show myself as I am." And then she urged him to issue a proclamation repudiating the slanders. But as the questioning intensified, the united front began to crumble, and with the evidences and testimonies gathered, Seymour's guilt was a formality. On the 24th of February 1549, the Privy Council reported their findings to the king. In all, 33 charges were laid against Seymour. Somerset declared, quote, "How sorrowful a case this was unto him," end quote. But he did, quote, "rather regard my burden to the duty of the king's majesty and the crown of England, that his own son or brother did weigh more his allegiance than his blood," end quote. In the end, he said he would not resist, nor would he be against the Lord's request. If he had done the same, he would not think himself worthy of life. Those gathered then waited for Edward to speak, to pronounce sentence. They knew what he was going to say, because his words had already been written, but appearances needed to be kept up. Though the charges they brought against Seymour showed all too clearly otherwise, they needed to believe that Edward bore the weight of his majesty himself. Formality and ceremony disguised the instability within the realm, carpeting over the underlying cracks which were beginning to form beneath Edward's very feet. So Edward finally spoke. We have these words recorded. "We do perceive that there is great things objected and laid to Lord Admiral, mine uncle, and they tend to treason. And we perceive that you require but justice to be done. We think it reasonable, and we will well that we proceed according to your request." Those words are followed by something written in the council register that reads as follows. With these words coming so suddenly from his grace's mouth of his own motion, the lords and rest of the council were marvelously rejoiced, and gave his highness most hearty praise and thanks, end quote. And so the charade that this had all come from Edward's mouth would continue. On the 25th of February, a bill of attainder was introduced into Parliament, passing unopposed through the House of Lords. Out of pity, Somerset was allowed to take his leave. But by the time the bill reached Commons, it was, quote, very much debated and argued, end quote. And lawyers were brought in to defend the charge that Seymour's doings had actually encompassed high treason. On March the 5th, the Commons finally passed the bill, with only 12 dissenters. Seymour was declared guilty of high treason and sentenced to death. Somerset himself signed his brother's death warrant, his signature so shaky that historians today consider it almost illegible. Edward only gave a sparse judgment, writing, quote, "I will and command you to proceed at your request without further molestation of myself or the Lord Protector. I pray you, my lords, do so." End quote. On the 19th of March, 1549, Thomas Seymour, brother to Lord Somerset, was executed upon Tower Hill. He continued objecting until the very last. While imprisoned in the Tower, he had fashioned a pen out of a piece of metal he had pulled off his jacket, and making his ink, quote, "so craftily and with such workmanship as the like had not been seen," he wrote to Elizabeth and Mary, encouraging them both to conspire against Edward. He sewed the letters into the soles of his velvet shoes and ordered his servants to retrieve them even after his death, pleading with the council for his execution to be delayed so that they might be present at the scaffold. But in the end, even these secret letters were discovered, and his plans were thwarted. No crowds were there to witness Seymour's end. He requested that his daughter be brought to him, but we have no idea if that happened. Reportedly, his final words were, quote, "I have been brought here to suffer death, for as I was lawfully born into this world, so I must lawfully leave it, because there is some work to be accomplished, which cannot be fulfilled unless I am put out of the way." Edward wrote nothing of his uncle's death in his diary, so we have no idea at all how the young king felt the time that he was executed. Elizabeth, for her part, never forgot the injustice of Seymour's death. Upon hearing the news, she was said to have remarked, quote, "This day died a man of much wit and very little judgment," end quote. Later, Seymour's fall would become a familiar lesson to the ambitious reaching beyond their means. As another English historian would later remark, quote, "His climbing high, disdained by his peers, was thought the cause he lived not out his years," end quote. Work soon got underway to make Edward's privy chamber more secure, but in the end, the damage to Somerset's reputation was irreparable. After all, it was his brother who had fomented treason. Indeed, after his brother's death, Somerset was really never the same person. Everyone wrote that. If anything, Somerset's authority had been seriously called into question. Not only had he failed in his duty to protect the king as the governor of his person, but he had heard for himself the king's testimony, suggesting that Edward thought he might be better off dead. His grip upon power had begun to loosen, and the crisis had forced him to bring Wriothesley back on board for a meeting of the entire council and executors in mid-January. Somerset's own behavior now also started to eat away at his reputation as the quote-unquote good duke. His lifestyle was lavish, and the accumulation of wealth massive. This did not match the constant preaching of fairness and equality of all. Nowhere was this more clear than when the construction of his new home, Somerset House. A nearby church had to be demolished to make room for this new palace, and no one really said much about that at the time. But when Somerset blew up the crypt for stone, now that was a step too far. Word that stone intermixed with scattered remains and bones was simply too much for the public to bear. But his personal problems were far outweighed by the escalating crises that were beginning to face the Kingdom of England. The now futile war against Scotland was proving increasingly expensive. Somerset would eventually spend £580,000, that's about $146 million in today's money, on the campaign. $351,000 of that was on troops alone. Since England was unable to recruit the numbers of men needed for garrisoning as well as regular service, he had to hire a total of almost 7,500 mercenaries. These from all nations. There were Italians, Germans, Spaniards, Albanians, Hungarians, even Irishmen. Compared to Henry's vast military expenditure in the last years of his life, Somerset had spent nearly double and in half the time. Moreover, the rush of religious change continued, culminating in the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer in Parliament during November and December 1548. The book rendered the Latin Mass into English, though its message remained essentially one of compromise. The book was relatively conservative in content and form. But make no mistake about it, the Book of Common Prayer represented the true and final break in England with medieval Catholicism. The elevation of the host was gone. The doctrine of the sacrifice of the Mass was done. The traditional feast and fast cycle over. More than the abolition of what had been the already dying monasteries, this moment was the moment that medieval religion died in England. And it took place in Edward's reign, not Henry's. But apart from religion, as I mentioned, Somerset had some real headaches. France was on the verge of declaring war. The treasury was nearly empty. Without an ally, many believed England would likely fall. Everyone was forecasting doom. None more so than Hugh Latimer, the reformist London minister. He warned the English people of, quote, the greed of you landlords, you rent-raisers. I may say you step-lords, you natural lords. You have your possessions yearly too much, end quote. They were wise words. Someone should have listened. Until next time, if you're interested in more content, please check out the links in the show notes. Links to the website where you'll find everything that you need there. Or if you'd like a free 7-day trial of the Patreon feed for Western Civ 2.0, we are back in ancient Rome now. And I know folks can't get enough of ancient Rome, so if you'd like a free listen of some of those episodes, check it out. Link in the show notes.